Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on using cover crops to suppress weeds in Northeast U.S. farming systems. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with e-extension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our recorded webinars, information about upcoming webinars, as well as articles and videos on organic farming on our website at extension.org/organic_production. I'd like to briefly introduce today's speakers. We're very excited to have Bill Curran and Matt Ryan of Penn State University with us today. Bill Curran is a professor of weed science in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. Bill's extension and research programs focus on integrated weed management and weed management in conservation tillage systems, including managing cover crops in conventional and organic-based cropping systems. Matt Ryan is a postdoctoral scholar in weed ecology at the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at Penn State. Matt completed his MS and PhD degrees at Penn State in weed ecology, focused on ecologically based weed management in organic cropping systems. Matt is currently a principal scientist on USDA Organic Research and Extension Initiative project that's examining longer-term weed and insect management in organic rotational no-till grain production. After the 45-minute presentation, you will have the chance to ask questions. If you have a question, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you can't see the question box, click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for in the 30-minute question period following the presentation. Okay, now I'm going to switch control of the presentation over to you, Bill.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Curran, and it's a pleasure for Matt and I to be with you this afternoon. Maybe some of you are from the West Coast and it's still morning. But we're going to talk about using cover crops to suppress weeds, and although our presentation will be focused on Northeast farming systems, I think there's a lot of applicability across the United States. We're going to talk about really two main areas today. You can see the outline. We're going to talk about how do cover crops help suppress weeds, some of the mechanisms associated with those, and then the second half will be how can you, either as farmers or researchers or managers, manipulate cover crops to help improve weed suppression. I'll be doing the first part of the presentation, and then Matt will be doing the second part, talking about manipulation. So we'll go ahead and begin. Sort of the reason for this presentation today is an outgrowth from a publication that we produced last year that Matt and I and others were authors on. And this is a publication called Suppressing Weeds and Weeds Using Cover Crops in Pennsylvania. So it does tend to have a Northeast focus, but again, I think a lot of application across the United States. It's a color publication that's available for free. And on this slide you see a website that you can download the PDF, or if you would like printed copies, you can get them through the Ag Publications Office through the information that I have available for you there. So really what we're going to be going through today is contained within this publication, although the publication is not strictly focused on organic, and so we've sort of boiled it down to focus in on that in particular. So we all know that managing weeds in organic systems can be a challenge, and Matt Liebman and Eric Gallant, two weed science colleagues of Matt and mine, coined the term many little hammers back in the late 90s as a term that is really relevant for organic systems, and that is the combining of a number of strategies or little hammers to reduce the fitness of weeds relative to the crop. And of course, everybody that deals in organic systems knows that there's no easy solution, and so we try to rely on multiple tactics. And so I have here some things listed as things that I would consider large hammers. Things like herbicides. I think plowing we'd consider a large hammer, maybe mowing, things that actually have an immediate effect, and then just some examples of some little hammers, things that we know it would take a number of tactics combined to really have a major impact. In thinking about this and where cover crops fit in, I sort of felt like there was a third category, and maybe we would call those medium hammers, and this would include things like crop rotation, which we know can have really dramatic impacts on weeds. I think when we plant the crop, the date that we plant it can have a dramatic impact, and I think sort of cover crops fit into that category as well, where it's not a large hammer, it's not a little hammer, but maybe more of a medium hammer. So the way we're going to approach at least the first half of the presentation today is based on this diagram, and really the focus of today's presentation will primarily concentrate on annual weeds, weeds that only live a year or less and reproduce through seed production, and it's really trying to manage that seed bank. That soiled seed bank is critically important in organic systems, and trying to drive that seed bank down. And so if we look at this diagram, we see sort of the life cycle of an annual weed, and we know that cover crops can suppress weeds at different stages within that life cycle. And so we're going to sort of go through these different stages within the life cycle, and then along the left-hand side you see listed a number of tactics, things that we can manage and maybe things that we can't manage as easily, and we'll discuss sort of how these come into play. So the way this diagram works is we start off with the seed bank, which then turns into the germinating seedling, the white thread stage, going through the seedling, vegetative growth, and then finally we end up with seed production. And again, these variables on the left-hand side are different things that could come into play based on the time within that life cycle. And so what we'll do is we'll start off with the beginning of that life cycle. If I can get the slide to advance. Losing my train of thought here, I apologize. Start off at the beginning of that life cycle where we have the seed bank and then the germinating seedling. And we know at that time there's a couple of things that can have a strong influence, microenvironment being one, and then also the potential for natural enemies. And so we're going to start off talking about those two. These tend to be things that we maybe can manage not as easily as some other things. The microenvironment, in terms of a cover crop, we know that if it's living or as a mulch, it alters the soil moisture. It can sometimes increase it or decrease it. It can reduce soil temperature. It reduces light reaching the soil surface. And these are a number of things that can affect the germination of weed seeds in the soil, and then also affect their long-term survival in the seed bank. We also know that during this seed bank to germination, there's a number of natural predators, parasites that can be out there, natural enemies, and that a cover crop can help harbor some of these predators of weed seeds or potential pathogens that can reduce or inhibit weed growth. Here's a diagram of a weed seed or a weed seed germinating, and sort of looking at the fate of that weed seed. And of course, one of our objectives is to stop that seed from germinating and living and causing us problems. And what we'd really like to be able to do is maybe we could have it eaten by a predator, or it could remain dormant for a very long time where it's not going to become a problem. All seeds aren't viable. Some of them are dead. Eventually they're going to decay if they don't germinate and live, and maybe we can get the thing to germinate and actually die without ever causing a problem. And so these are sort of the things that are happening below ground that we tend to have less influence on, but we also know that there's a number of factors that we do in our management scheme that can influence this process. Mentioned briefly the idea of natural enemies. One of those would be weed seed predators, and this is sort of a blooming area of research right now. There's been a fair amount of research that's happened in the last 10 years and more all the time, but we know that weed seed predators in particular can have a significant effect on weed seeds in agroecosystems, and it's not unusual to see a 50% loss in weed seeds depending on how management is being conducted. Some of the most promising seed predators tend to be things like rodents, like mice, which we may not want to encourage, but maybe things like ants, crickets, and ground beetles may be things that we do want to encourage. And I think the main point that we want to make today is this is an area that has a lot of promise. It's still not an area that that you can bring out and launch out of the box, but some things that we do know that can make it more effective would be things like reducing pesticide use, reducing tillage frequency. Lots of tillage will discourage seed predation. It will bury the seeds, particularly late in the summer and early fall when those seeds are falling to the ground and can act as a food source. And I think relevant to today's presentation is we know that cover or habitat is really important for seed predators, and so cover crops can help establish some of that habitat. In addition to that, things like promoting fence rows, filter strips, and refuge strips. So we sort of talked about the seed bank and the germination, and the next step along the way is sort of that germination to seed production. And we know that there's a number of factors that can influence those. The germinating seed, the white thread stage, again, it becomes a seedling, vegetative growth, and then seed production. And during that time frame, you can see things like physical suppression, allelopathy, competition from the cover crop, and then depending on how we control the cover crop, that can come into play as well. And so we're gonna go through each of these as well. So germination to seed production, we'll start off with the physical suppression and allelopathy. We know that particularly when we kill a cover crop and we can no-till into that mulch, that killed cover crop mulch can interfere with germination and establishment of weeds. It can prevent both germination, and also it can physically interfere with establishment, basically acting as a barrier. And this is especially effective against small-seeded annual weeds. We also know there's a term that that we'd like to take advantage of more that's called allelopathy. And we know that some cover crops, some examples would be forage radish, cereal rye, there's others as well, release chemical compounds which can inhibit the growth of other plants. And hopefully in our case it's weeds. This is called allelopathy, and this actually can occur either by leaving surface residues or by leaving residues on the surface, but it also can occur to some degree if we use cover crops as a green manure and we incorporate them with tillage, although for the most part the greatest benefit would be leaving those residues on the surface. We know that if we leave cover crop residues or a mulch on the surface, it has some really direct effects on what's happening in the soil. We smother the soil surface, we lower the soil temperature, we reduce the highs and lows of that soil temperature, we reduce light penetration, we can hold soil moisture, which can be an advantage certainly for the crop. They could release allelochemicals. These are what we call the compounds that are within allelopathy. And then hopefully the ultimate goal would be to reduce weed germination and emergence. This is an example of some of the research that we've been involved in, where we've been looking at rolling cover crops, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is a rolled hairy vetch mulch, rolled sometime in the middle to the third week of May. This is actually down in central Virginia. With a collaborator, Brian Jones, who did this work, and this is a photo showing that rolled mulch with a corn crop that was no-tilled into it 5 to 6 weeks after planting, and we know that cover crop mulch can do a fair amount at suppressing weeds, but we also know, and this is one of the things that we want to talk about today, that oftentimes it may not be adequate, or that there's things that we need to try to improve that suppression. And in fact, in this picture you can see looks like some foxtails or some other annual weeds starting to break through that mulch at that 5 to 6 week period. We've had some really promising results in some of our research trials, and just as an example, this is some work that a former graduate student, Ruth Mischler, who was here in 2007 and 2008, did a lot of work with hairy vetch and corn, and this figure shows pounds of weed biomass per acre on the vertical axes, and then we have a vetch cover crop and then no vetch cover crop. So in this particular study, we went in there in late summer and we harvested the weeds within those treatments, and then measured how many weeds were there, and you can see that the presence of that vetch greatly reduced the amount of biomass that was there. It didn't reduce it down to zero, but depending on what weeds you have and how severe they are, it could do a pretty nice job versus no control, no vetch in this case, more than 5,000 pounds of weed dry matter, which certainly would be quite devastating to crop yield. So we know that cover crops, and particularly when we leave them on the surface, can have a pretty profound effect, but there's a number of things that come into play there. The species of cover crop can be important, and one of the reasons why species is important is because the residue quality, and really by quality we may be talking a lot about type and age and amount. carbon and nitrogen, how much fiber is there in that cover crop material, how much carbon to nitrogen ratio, or what's the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So for example, something like rye, which is much higher in carbon than say a legume like hairy vetch, it's going to persist for a longer time, and it's going to generally have a greater impact on a weed seedling than something that's going to break down more quickly. We know that in terms of weed species, that the small seeded annual weeds, things like pigweed would be a good example, require light for germination and are going to be the most sensitive to those cover crop residues. And we know that certain weeds it's not going to be very effective on. Perennials, which is one of the reasons why we're not talking about perennials today, they're going to continue to be a problem in those systems that are relying on cover crops, certainly when they're being used as a surface residue. And then also large seeded annuals, things that have a lot of energy and they can push through a mulch, are going to be harder to manage with surface mulches. We also know that weeds that have similar growth habits to the cover crop that we're using are going to be more successful. So for example, if we were using oats in spring as a cover crop, we're going to probably still have problems with early emerging spring annual weeds. So the idea would be to try to select cover crops that have different growth habits than the weeds you're trying to manage. This is a really nice diagram that I use quite a bit in some of my presentations, and it's some research by Chuck Moeller and John Teasdale. Chuck is at Cornell and John is with the USDA, and you can see it's a little more than 15 years old now, but still very relevant. And here we're showing the number of weed seedlings per meter squared here, so number of seedlings per unit of area over an increasing amount of rye mulch. And so this is rye that was would have been put out there or killed in the springtime, and then the weeds would have been measured some period of time after that, 4 to 6 weeks after the mulch was in place. And what you see here are a number of species of weeds: velvet leaf, lamb's quarters, curly dock, dandelion, pigweed, witchgrass, and chickweed. And so we have some sort of large seeded species like velvet leaf, which has a fairly big seed, versus some smaller seeded species like pigweed. And what we see here is as we increase the amount of rye mulch, we tend to decrease the density of the weeds. And so there's a very clear relationship here that as cover crop mulch or cover crop biomass increases, the success of the weeds go down. And so what you'd really like to know is there a critical amount of biomass that I need before I can see this relationship. And you'll see it depends really on the weed. So that large seeded velvet leaf, here the 5 would be equivalent to 5,000 pounds of dry matter. So at 5,000 pounds of dry matter, we're still not doing a very good job on reducing velvet leaf emergence. On the other hand, at 5,000 pounds of dry matter, we've done a pretty nice job suppressing pigweed, witchgrass, chickweed, and lamb's quarters, some of the smaller seeded types of weeds, whereas the larger seeded ones like the velvet leaf, you're looking at maybe 8,000 or 10,000 pounds of dry matter before you actually would start to really see a reduction, at least in the research that Chuck and John did. Some of the, I think, some of the practical applications that John suggested with some of this work and other work that he's done is that cover crops producing high biomass will certainly enhance weed suppression. And one of the things I think that there's a lot of interest in now is looking at combinations. Some people are using the term cocktails of cover crops rather than individual species, trying to capture some diversity and some of the benefit that you can get from more than one species. We know that residues that decompose slowly will extend the period of weed suppression. That sort of goes back to that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Things that degrade rapidly are not going to do as well as things that last longer. That low residue amounts can stimulate weed emergence. So this is one of the things that I've observed in some of my work, that if you're less than 2,000 pounds of dry matter and certainly less than 1,000 pounds, that you might actually see more weeds because it's holding the surface moisture more efficiently, and maybe it actually produces a better seed bed for germination and establishment of weeds. So low residue amounts actually could be a problem, and that certainly multiply packed layers of residue which makes sense. Things that are denser are going to be more effective than things that are more loosely packed. And I think some of the benefits that we've seen with using a roller come into play maybe with that more densely packed residues that we'll talk about. The other term that we use a lot out there, although I can't say there's a lot of practical application at this point, is allelopathy, and there's been a lot of research in allelopathy. This is where a form of plant interference occurs when one plant, it can be either living or it can be a dead plant, and this decaying tissue interferes with the growth of another plant as it releases a chemical, an allelochemical. And there are a number of examples of this in nature, and there's been a lot of research that's shown, certainly in the lab, that this occurs. This is some work from Matt Liebman at Iowa State University, and Matt looked at red clover solution, an extract, a 2% solution, and on the left you see velvet leaf seedlings in a petri dish that are just with water, versus on the right where it's with this red clover solution, and there's obviously an inhibition in the growth of those velvet leaf roots, for the radical there. And so you can show this fairly routinely under controlled conditions, but you try to take this out into the field and try to use this to your advantage, and it becomes very difficult. There's a number of examples, I say, in nature of allelopathy, and some things that most of us are familiar with. At least some things like black walnut is one that is well known, a compound called juglone. Spotted knapweed, there's been unfortunately, this is a bad weed, but there's been a number of articles in the press the last 5 years about spotted knapweed and a compound that they've isolated, that actually they're trying to synthesize into some sort of a herbicide product. But I think the good news is that there's a number of crop species. Sorghum is one, and so thinking about sorghum sudan grass as a cover crop and why that is such an aggressive, effective cover during the summertime is because maybe because part of it is because of allelopathy. We know that certain brassicas, in some cases they're weeds like garlic mustard, but also things like oilseed rape, some of the tillage radish or the daikon radish, forage radish, that these produce toxins that can be effective against weeds, insects, nematodes in some cases. And then there's been a lot of work with cereal rye, which is one that is known to produce a number of allelochemicals, and there's been work that's looked at cultivars and when those concentrations are greatest in the plant and how we can capture those. And so I think the good news is that this is another area that is being actively researched, and that I would hope that in the near future that we'll see some answers that become perhaps practical. But right now, the mechanisms and management are still relatively poorly understood. So we have been through physical suppression and allelopathy, and we're going to sort of keep moving along here with our annual weed, looking at competition. And we can offer a lot of things with cover crops through competition for space, nutrients, light, from the white thread stage through seed production. This is where the cover crop in this case is alive, and it's competing with the weeds for these limited resources. And so to me, this is kind of the no-brainer of the presentation today. We're using cover crops. I have some examples here that are growing. They're filling a niche that weeds might otherwise fill, and so yet we have this benefit, hopefully, that we're trying to capture also with that cover crop. So we're not maybe just using it obviously for weed suppression. We're using it could be for nitrogen production. It could be to hold the soil. It could be to break a plow pan. So it could be for a number of other reasons. And one of the side benefits is that we're also suppressing weeds. So to me, there's a lot of opportunity here. In the Northeast, a number of states, Maryland may be in the lead, have some incentive programs to plant cover crops. Most of those incentives are related to water and water quality. In the case of Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay, we have some of those programs also here in Pennsylvania, and so there's some real opportunity to maybe get more bang for the buck by trying to use those for multiple purposes. And just a couple of examples from some slides that I have here. Winter annual crops can obviously have a big impact on winter annual weeds. And you see here a field of hairy vetch in the springtime where there was a skip and the hairy vetch was not seeded, and you see looks like a pepperweed, a winter annual weed that has taken hold in there, versus where we have the hairy vetch. It's going to be very competitive against that. Some work that I'm borrowing from the University of Maryland, where in the background we have a winter rye crop growing, being very competitive against anything that may be emerging in the spring. In the middle there was forage radish, or the daikon radish that winter killed, but yet it's still a very nice clean seed bed in early spring versus no cover, which seems to be mostly chickweed and other winter annuals. And so again, the idea of doing a lot of damage to winter annuals in particular, and I think also some perennials, cool season perennials, by having that winter cover out there doing a number of things for us. Mark Van Gessel, who we work with pretty closely here at Penn State, has done a lot of work with one weed in particular that's a problem here in the mid-Atlantic region called horseweed or mare's tail. Become a big problem sort of through the mid-Atlantic region down into the southern corn belt, and he has been doing some work with rye cover crops. This is some work that he did a few years back, where he's looking at rye seeded at different rates. You can see 0, a half, 1, and 2 bushels per acre. He did this experiment at 3 locations back in 2003 and 2004, and this is the number of mare's tail or horseweed again per unit of area, in this case per meter squared, and you can see a really nice relationship as he increases the seeding rate of rye. He decreases the number of weeds that are there. Certainly at location 1 and at location 3, also a pretty nice relationship. Not quite as consistent at location 2, but we certainly know that with winter annuals like mare's tail and others, that they don't like to compete with other plants, and so you have an aggressive cover crop like rye, and Matt's going to talk more about this. You can manipulate that cover crop to do a little bit better job, perhaps based on seeding rate or other ways that we manage it. So there we've gotten through competition, and we're down to control, and this may be also one of the most effective ways to impact the weed population, and most of the time we're doing that maybe when the weeds are in their vegetative stage of growth, or perhaps we're trying to impact seed production, which obviously is an acceptable tactic or a desirable tactic to try to prevent some of those weeds from going to seed. And there's a number of ways we might do this in organic systems. You know, with a cover crop, we're maybe mowing it, we may be tilling it, we may be trying to roll it. Other ways that we're trying to manage that, and we know that this can interfere with weed emergence and growth, and can be particularly effective prior to germination and emergence of the weeds, but also prior to when that weed sets seed. So it may be a tactic that we use, for example, in the springtime to prevent winter annual weed seed production. We have several options in organic systems on how we manage cover crops. I've broken them down into 2 categories here. The first one I'm calling cultural, and a cultural tactic, really we're using nature as our friend, and a couple of examples of cultural tactics would be, or I'd say one example of a cultural tactic might be planting something that winter kills. And so the picture in the upper right is winter-killed spring oats seeded in the fall, and the one beneath that is winter-killed forage radish, or tillage radish, as it's called in our area. And so we're relying on those winter temperatures here in our region to take that cover crop out. This is going to have this is certainly going to have an effect on winter annuals. It's not going to be a tactic that we would want to rely on if we're looking to manage summer annual weeds, which is much of the interest in our research here. And so we've been relying more on mechanical kinds of controls, and certainly the number 1 tactic in an organic system would be some sort of tillage, where we would plow down that cover crop in the spring. And obviously this can have a big effect on some weeds. I say we're not talking about perennials here today, but that's certainly going to be one of the more dramatic ways that we could manage perennials or emerged annuals or emerging annuals. But we also know that when we plow down that cover crop, we also lose much of the weed suppression benefit that might take place after that point in time, so much of the residual benefit. And so most of our research here, looking at organic and looking at trying to use cover crops, is focused on mechanisms that we might be able to no-till. And so that might be mowing or rolling. And in our particular work, we've really been focused on the idea of rolling. It's a work in progress. We've learned a lot over the last 6 or 7 years, and I think we are still learning. There's a publication that's available that we put together last year. There's a website that I have there for a PDF. It's actually an online publication. You can see that www.weeds.psu.edu/PDF/roller, and basically it's a publication that goes through some of the, I'd say, the pluses and the minuses, because there are both. Rollers have their place, and they can work, but also they're not for everybody. They have a particular niche. And so I'd encourage you, if you're interested in rollers, to take a look at this publication and certainly talk to farmers and others that have relied on this or tried it. Some things that we've learned over the last few years about rollers and crimpers, that they're good for controlling some reproductive annual cover crops. They're not effective on perennials. They tend to be less effective on legume cover crops than on cereals. Actually, they're most effective on winter cereals when they're flowering, so rye and wheat when they're actually into the flowering stage. And then one of the things that is problematic for some growers, it depends on where you are, but it can delay planting of the cash crop. So here in Pennsylvania, when we're rolling, for example, rye, when it's susceptible, oftentimes we're in the last half of May in the central part of the state. And so for some crops that may be late, and for others it's not. And so the timing of when you can use this effectively can become an issue. There's a lot of interest in using this in organic systems. That's our interest principally, but there also is some interest in using it in conventional no-till sorts of systems. Just quickly, some suitable cover crops that we're interested in and that we've been testing: rye, wheat, barley, hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea, and there are some others. And I think the future is that more research and testing is needed, and in particular maybe looking at some cover crop mixtures and how these would play with suitable cash crops. So that brings me to the end of my portion of the presentation, and just sort of to summarize the points that I wanted to make. Cover crops are used for many different reasons, and hopefully weed control is one of those benefits. We know that weed seed banks can be strongly influenced by the environment and by potential natural enemies such as weed seed predators, but we're just beginning to understand some of those relationships. Physical and chemical weed suppression with cover crops is sort of the focus that our research has taken, and we're really kind of looking at that, but it does require special management tactics that may or may not fit your farm management system. And part of the reason why we would say that is because high biomass cover crops are really what are necessary for weed suppression. The more biomass, the better, and rolling that has been pretty effective. But also we know that rolling instead of tillage and maybe mowing can be more challenging to manage. And to me, the no-brainer, the thing that I think everybody should be doing is planting competitive winter cover crops, or planting cover crops during spring or summer fallow periods when we're really trying to fill some of those niches, and this can have a big impact on weeds. It can have environmental and ecological benefits, and at least in some states and in some counties within some states there may be some financial incentives that can make this even better. So I'll turn the program over to Matt, and he'll continue from there.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. I'm going to be talking about different ways where we can manipulate cover crops to improve weed suppression. I think I have control of the presentation, but it doesn't look like it.
Just a second, Matt. We're giving you control.
Okay.
In the meantime, I can advance the slide for you.
Okay. I'm going to be talking about species selection, dates, rates, and then soil fertility as ways that we're thinking about manipulating cover crops to improve weed suppression. And when we're thinking about selection, cover crop selection, we're really thinking about the competitiveness of the cover crop and also while it's living, and then also the physical suppression once it's terminated. Alice, can you advance the slide, please?
Yep.
Okay. And so when you're thinking about selecting cover crops, you really want to think about making the cover crop work for you and thinking about what you want the cover crop to do. Do you want it to provide habitat for weed seed predators? Do you want to suppress winter annuals and perennials? Or do you want to produce a lot of biomass for mulch? So having those things in mind, what the purpose of your cover crop and what you want to do with it is really important when you're making your choice of what cover crop you want to use. Of course, there are other considerations, particularly cost, whether or not it's going to survive over the winter, whether or not it produces nitrogen and the effects on soil fertility, and also the establishment timing. In addition to thinking about different species, and what we have listed here is in that handout or in that publication that Bill mentioned at the beginning that's online, Weed Suppressive Cover Crops for Pennsylvania. But in addition to thinking about different species, you also want to think about different cultivars within the same species. For example, we like using a rustic rye because that produces a little bit more biomass than some of the other rye cultivars that you could use. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. And then also the establishment timing and termination timing. We can go to the next slide there, that'd be great. Yeah, the establishment timing is really important to consider to make it sure that the cover crop that you do want to use will fit into your crop rotation. We've done a number, advance please. We've done some work looking at mainly two different cover crops, cereal rye and hairy vetch, looking at different establishment dates and termination dates. And one of the things that we found is that planting winter cover crops, particularly small grains, planting them early, we found is a great way to increase their competitive ability and their weed suppressiveness. We also know that delaying termination will allow you to produce more cover crop biomass, which is really important for mulch-based systems. One thing I just want to mention real quick before I say that it's always best to plant cover crops early. You can plant hairy vetch a little too early, so that's something that you do want to watch out for. In Pennsylvania, we're typically looking at late August to early September for planting hairy vetch. Next slide. What I'm going to talk about now is some work that was done by Stephen Mirsky while he was at Penn State. He looked at 6 different seeding rates or seeding dates of cereal rye and 4 different termination dates, and ranging from August 25th to October 15th for the seeding, and then from May 1st to May 30th for termination. Next slide. Here's a photograph of what those plots looked like. All of these plots were seeded at 2.5 bushels per acre on 7.5-inch rows. Next slide. And what you're looking at here is the ground cover as a result of the different rye planting dates in the fall. As you can see at the early planting date, the August 25th, there's almost complete ground coverage, whereas in the October 15th seeding dates, you can see quite a bit of bare soil between the rows of rye. And that's really what we're trying to avoid there. We want to get a nice solid stand of the cover crop so that we can suppress weeds that would potentially merge and compete with the rye cover crop and set seed. So that's one of the things that we're really looking to do with our earlier planting dates is increase the ground coverage. Next slide. As you can see in this photograph, the October 15th planting date was in the back, and you can again see the rows and see the bare soil between those rows. And in the foreground, you can see the earlier planting date, the September 15th planting date, where you can barely see the rows of rye and you really don't see much bare soil. And this is really important because, again, this is what is helping to suppress the germination and establishment of the winter annual and perennial weeds that you see in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. And so what Stephen did with this, he had, again, 6 different planting dates in the fall and 4 different planting dates in the, or termination dates in the spring. And what we were seeing in this research was that there is a big difference in the amount of biomass that you produce. So not only is ground cover influenced, but also the amount of rye biomass production is also influenced by these different dates. And what you can see in the next slide is that we found that approximately 1 month in the fall was roughly equal to 1 week in the spring. So by planting 1 month earlier in the fall, we were able to increase our rye biomass by approximately 2,000 pounds per acre, which was about the same as delaying termination 1 week in the spring. So if you can go to the next slide, you can see that relationship a little closer. Again, 1 month in the fall roughly equal to 1 week in the spring. Next slide. And so this impact on the ground cover and on the rye biomass also had an impact on the lamb's quarter density, is what we're looking at here across the 6 different planting dates and then in the control plot. And as you can see on the bottom axis, on the x-axis there, we have the different cover crop planting dates. And as the seeding date is delayed in the fall from August to October, that carried over into having an effect the next spring on the emergence of lamb's quarters and the density of lamb's quarters in those plots, where we had quite a bit more lamb's quarters in those plots that were seeded to rye in October compared to August. Next slide. We also did some work here at Penn State looking at different termination dates of hairy vetch. And the main reason why we were doing this is to look at ways to control hairy vetch in organic systems with the roller crimper, and when that would be most effective to do with the roller crimper. And what we found in this research that was done by Ruth Mishler again when she was a graduate student here at Penn State was that in order to get consistent control with the roller crimper, you really needed to wait into the early pod stage, as you can see in this diagram here. Next slide. And so what we found when we were delaying termination of hairy vetch was that you could increase hairy vetch biomass from between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds per acre by delaying termination 2 to 3 weeks from when the hairy vetch is in the vegetative state compared to when the hairy vetch is in the early pod stage. And so there's a lot of information here in this table, but what I really wanted to show you is that there are different dates there, and you can see the effect of the different termination dates on not only the flowering and the control of the hairy vetch, but also on the amount of hairy vetch biomass that was produced. Next slide. And another benefit of delaying cover crop termination is that you can sometimes avoid weeds. If you can advance the slide, that would be good. And what we're seeing here is if you delay termination from April until June, you can sometimes, again, avoid these weeds that would be coming up during that time. And if you're plowing down your cover crop, those weeds would emerge and then be removed with the plowing. But if you're also rolling the cover crop, that's something that you want to consider too, is the emergence periodicity of the weeds. And what we're seeing here is that there's 3 different weeds: the velvet leaf, giant foxtail, and common lamb's quarters. And you can see the time in which they're emerging and the proportion of total emergence. So if you can go in and manage your cover crop after they are already emerged, again, you can sometimes avoid having to deal with those weeds. Next slide. Next thing I want to talk to you about is seeding rate and seeding arrangement. And we've done, again, research looking at increasing your seeding rate to improve the competitiveness of your cover crops, and also looking at different ways of seeding arrangement or row spacing of your cover crops, again, to increase weed suppression potential. Next slide. Having good ground coverage of your cover crops is really important because there's a number of early germinating weeds that will actually emerge with the cover crop if you do not have adequate cover crop ground cover. And what we're looking at here is wild buckwheat and common ragweed, which are both emerged very early. And what you can see, what's really noticeable in this photograph is that there's these early weeds, but also the amount of sunlight and the amount of bare soil that's going through this rye canopy. So that's another reason why we want to get good ground coverage and have a lot of a very thick, lush cover crop growing when we're trying to suppress weeds. Next slide. So in addition to having good ground cover, we want to make sure that we have a lot of biomass if we're relying on biomass for mulch in these mulch-based systems. And this is just an example of how researchers go out and quantify the amount of biomass that they have. They usually put down a quadrat, clip out the cover crop residue, and then go and weigh it. And so that's, again, trying to maximize the amount of biomass that we have with these cover crops. Next slide. We did an experiment in 2007 and 2008 in Pennsylvania and in Maryland where we went out and we seeded rye at 3 different rates, 1.5, 2.5, and 3.5 bushels per acre. And what we saw was that it really didn't impact rye biomass all that much. But what it did do is have an impact on weed biomass. Next slide. And so you can see that there was no impact on the rye biomass from the previous slide, but in this slide you can see that increasing your rye seeding rate did decrease weed biomass, and that's really what we were looking to do. And if you go to the next slide, there's just a summary of that, and you can see both of these. We're not exactly sure why we saw this decrease in weed biomass, because we did not see an increase in rye biomass, but we do know that increasing seeding rate did decrease weeds. And so in addition to rye biomass, the other thing that we're thinking about here is ground cover. If you go to the next slide, you can see what we're trying for and what we're shooting for is a very thick rye cover crop early in the spring, which is going to prevent a lot of winter annuals and also summer annuals from germinating and competing with the cover crop and competing with the following cash crop. Next slide. Again, so one of the ways that we've been thinking about doing this is decreasing our row spacing. Here you can see the effects of seeding in 7.5-inch rows with a standard drill compared to seeding in slightly narrower rows at 5.5-inch row spacing. These are both seeded at the same time and at the same rate. You go to the next slide. So in addition to looking at narrower row spacing, we realized that not everybody has access to drills that have narrow rows. So the next best thing that you can do is try to broadcast some of your cover crop seed. And I've talked to some farmers that broadcast all of their seed this way. But what we did in this situation was we took half of the cover crop and we put it in a spinner. And the idea here is that you could put that on the front of your tractor, have a front-mounted broadcast spreader, and go through with one pass and split the amount of cover crop seed that you're putting out, put half of it up front and the broadcast application, and then drill half of it behind. And that results in this very thick, lush cover crop early in the spring, which is ideal for suppressing weeds. Next slide. This is a photograph of our cover crop right now that we just took a couple days ago out of Rock Springs here in Pennsylvania. And what we did here in this case was we only broadcast 1/3 of the rye that we put out, and we drilled 2/3. And again, this was seeded in late September, and right now it's looking quite good. And we expect that this is going to suppress quite a bit of weeds next spring. Next slide. The last thing that I want to talk about is soil fertility, and it's really important consideration when you're trying to use cover crops for weed suppression. You want to make sure that you have enough soil fertility to grow good cover crop, but not too much that you're increasing the amount of weeds that you would have. Next slide. So this is a photograph of a rye cover crop, and again, this is a poor stand. This is from the same field that I was showing you where the wild buckwheat and the common ragweed were coming up, and you can see all the sunlight that is reaching the bare soil through the rye canopy here, and this was really a result of low soil fertility that prevented this rye from really reaching its potential. We've done some research, if you go to the next slide, looking at also applying poultry litter to try to increase our rye biomass. And what we did in this experiment was we went out in April and applied Purdue poultry pellets, which is basically poultry litter, at two different rates, and we had a no application control. And we did see an increase, a significant increase in rye biomass when we applied fertilizer. However, if you go to the next slide, you can see that although that we increased our rye biomass, we also increased the amount of weeds that we have out in our field. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see that this strategy really didn't work out that well for us. Again, we applied this poultry litter in April, and so what we're thinking is that if you really want to use fertility as a way to manipulate your cover crops, particularly your small grain cover crops, you really want to make sure you do that earlier in the growing season, earlier than April or even the previous fall, to make sure that the rye has a chance to utilize that extra added fertility, and that it's not necessarily available for weed growth. Next slide. This is a photograph of a field day we had at a collaborating farm in Maryland, and this is a case where a farmer had a cover crop that really wasn't that thick, but he was very interested in rolling it down and using it as mulch. And the decision was made to go through and roll it down, and it really caused quite a bit of weed problems because the cover crop was not, there wasn't enough biomass there to suppress weeds. And in this case, we believe that the cover crop biomass was low because the fertility was low, and also there was low amounts of rainfall. So that's another consideration that you need to deal with, making sure that you have adequate biomass, which can be affected by not only your soil fertility but also your rainfall. So for some farmers that are fortunate enough to have irrigation, that's another consideration that you may want to be thinking about when you're trying to optimize your cover crop growth to suppress weeds. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk to you about is just matching fertility needs of cover crops and cash crops. What you're looking at here is a photograph of soybeans that were organic soybeans that were no-till planted into a rye cover crop, and on the right you can see where there was no rye residue, where there was no rye cover crop, and on the left there was a very thick rye cover crop. And we really like to use rye before soybeans because rye tends to draw down the soil fertility, soil nitrogen, and because soybeans fix their own nitrogen, that's a great system where it really doesn't leave a lot of excess nutrients in the soil for weeds to capitalize on. Another common combination is planting hairy vetch before corn because hairy vetch fixes nitrogen and provides nitrogen for the corn. What you don't want to really be doing is planting vetch before soybeans, because you're just creating, although you're growing a lot of biomass and you could be suppressing weeds that way, you're also providing quite a bit of nutrients for weeds to take advantage of in a situation where you already have a crop, cash crop that does not need the nitrogen. And likewise, you don't want to be planting rye before corn, again, because you're not matching your fertility needs of your cover crop and your cash crop, and you're just making the situation worse for your corn. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to summarize what we've been talking about. We have found that adjusting planting and termination dates is a very effective way to increase your cover crop competitiveness and biomass production, and that we really want to be thinking about maximizing ground coverage early in the spring, and one way to do that is by increasing your cover crop seeding rate or by adjusting your row spacing or spatial arrangement by broadcast seeding in combination with drilling. Soil fertility is really important for cover crop growth, but too much soil fertility, especially applied at the wrong time, can actually increase weeds and make the situation worse. And finally, the soil fertility should be adjusted in the fall rather than in the spring to try to provide the most competitive advantage to your cover crop over your weeds. I'd like to just finish up. We go to the next slide, talking about some of the other work that's happening in Pennsylvania. There's a network of farmers that are involved in a demonstration trial that has, if we go to the next slide, you can find information on the website listed on your lower left. This is another website talking about these demonstrations that are at 11 different sites where they have 9 different species of cover crops plus 8 mixtures planted at 2 different dates. So you can go to this website and check out the results of these demonstration trials that are happening all over Pennsylvania. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to just put a plug in for our newsletter for the project that we're involved with here at Penn State, looking at using cover crops in reduced tillage organic systems. This is a project with collaborators down at USDA in Beltsville, Stephen Lersky, Chris Reberg-Horton down in North Carolina, and Mark Van Gessel at the University of Delaware. My last slide is, go to the next slide, just a plug about some upcoming webinars. Charlie White is going to be talking about using winter-killed cover crops to facilitate organic no-till planting for early spring vegetables. Most of our discussion here this afternoon has been focused on cover crops that are going to survive over the winter and produce a lot of biomass the next summer or the next spring. This is a slightly different approach, really focused on competition in the fall. And then the final webinar that's listed there is by Julie Grossman, Assessing Nitrogen Contribution and Rhizobia Diversity Associated with Winter Legume Cover Crops in Organic Systems. And I think at this point, we'd like to open it up for questions. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Bill. I just wanted to apologize for the technical problems that didn't allow you to advance your slides, but luckily we made it through. We're about to start our question and answer period, but before we do, we'd like to just ask you to take about 2 minutes to answer 3 very quick poll questions that will be helpful to Matt and Bill in terms of evaluating how well we filled some of the learning objectives of this webinar. So each question will be up on the screen for no more than about 30 seconds or so. So we've got 3 questions, so each one will be only up there really quickly, so if you could just launch those polls. Okay, the first question, how has this webinar improved your understanding of the following topics? How cover crop management can influence weed control, options to control cover crops like mowing and roller crimping, and how you can manipulate cover crops to influence weed control. So if you could just click those as fast as possible, and then we'll move on to the next question. Okay, that one's the second one. Has this event inspired you to get more information during the next year on, and check all that apply, how cover crop management can influence weed control, ways to control cover crops such as using a roller crimper, and how you can manipulate cover crops to influence weed control. So we'll just have that one up for a couple more seconds, and then we'll move on. Okay. All right, for the final question, as a result of today's event, how likely are you to make a change on your farm or in your educational programs during the next 2 years. Please select one. Okay, and then once that's done, we'll move on to the questions and answers. Okay, Matt and Bill, if you're both unmuted here, we can probably get started with the question and answers. For those of you who missed the beginning of the webinar, we'll have probably about 20 minutes or so to answer questions. And you can use the question box on your screen to type in questions and hit return. If the question box is closed, you can click the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. And we'll be reading the questions out loud, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. This webinar will also be posted on the eOrganic website within the coming week in case you would like to view it again or share it with others. And our website is right here. Our organic farming webinar, other organic farming webinars are already posted, and some of them are also available on our YouTube channel. So now we'll get started with the questions. Okay, what recommendations do you have for winter cover crops other than a rolled hairy vetch to improve soil and reduce weeds that will be not problematic for an early spring planting?
Okay, so I'll tackle that first, and then Matt can can pipe in. So we've been using hairy vetch a lot because it sort of fits our system here, but I also realize that it doesn't fit other people's system. Particularly, we have some winter cereal growers that do not like hairy vetch because it can be weedy actually in those systems with hard seed. It is one of the few winter annual legumes that you can effectively kill with rolling. Another one that we have done a little bit of work with is Austrian winter pea. And that actually is also quite winter hardy, and it fixes a lot of nitrogen. It tends not to produce as much, at least, biomass that suppresses weeds in our systems. It tends to be, the nice thing about hairy vetch is it's a viney sort of mess in the spring, and so when you roll it, it just sort of melts down, whereas pea would be more apt to leave some gaps. And so I don't think you'd achieve some of the weed suppression that you would get with vetch, but it does work as a nice winter legume cover for fixing nitrogen and some of those kinds of things. Beyond that, we've done some work with crimson clover. We've done some work with some of the other clovers, red clover, yellow blossom sweet clover, and for the most part, those are suitable in some systems. They don't really fit the roller crimper work that we've been interested in, and so our work, at least with legumes, for the most part, is kind of focused on winter annuals that we think we can kill without herbicides using a roller crimper, and the two that I can suggest would be the hairy vetch and the winter pea, at least today. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I was just going to say crimson clover. That's another one. It doesn't seem to be as weed suppressive, but it does fit the needs when you're not willing to use hairy vetch. Red clover too, but again, that's a slightly different beast because it's a perennial, whereas crimson clover is a winter annual and will be easier to kill in the spring.
Okay, we have a couple of questions coming in about the effects of these weed suppression methods on the following crop. The first question is, does cover crop mulch have the same negative effect on cultivated seeds as it does on weed seeds? And the next question is, have there been any studies showing the effects of allelopathic cover crops on the following crop, and how much time should pass before planting?
You want to start with that? Or?
Yeah, I'll start. So yes, so these cover crop mulches, you could say that they are somewhat non-selective, meaning that they could influence whatever you plant. The selectivity really, for the most part, is based on a lot of it is based on seed size, and so as I mentioned in my part of the presentation, they're most effective on small seeded weeds. And so if you're planting direct seeding crop seeds, that things like corn and soybean, you can be quite successful. If you were trying to seed smaller seeded crop species, the chances of success are going to be a lot less. So I would certainly not recommend at least the systems that we've described for things like sorghum, any of the legumes. I think cereals, winter cereals like or spring cereals, oats. I don't think those are suitable just because the smaller the seed, the less energy that seed has for pushing through a mulch. Another part that we really haven't addressed today is the establishment of those cash crops and some of the things that we need to do to make those successful, and that sort of comes down a lot to the equipment that you're using, and so planters and drills and how those are equipped and set up to get through that mulch is very key. Having good no-till coulters and disc openers, and we have not been doing a lot of work with trash cleaners and those kinds of things, at least here in Pennsylvania, but some folks, particularly our collaborators to the south in North Carolina, have been doing a lot more of that. So equipment is a big deal with some of these systems. The question about allelopathy, it's a similar answer in that, so you are looking at compounds that are sort of generalists. They aren't selective, so they're not going to necessarily affect well, they will affect some things more than others, but it tends to be for other reasons. Again, small seeded species, things that are close to the soil surface, are going to be influenced most. Larger seeded things with lots of energy tend to be less affected. There is also some relationship to like affects like, and so we've seen problems. For example, Matt mentioned you don't really want to seed, or you don't really want to plant corn into rye. Certainly in organic systems where you're trying to grow a lot of rye biomass because of not only the nutrient relationships that Matt talked about, but also there is a fair amount of evidence to show that rye is allelopathic and that it's more likely to affect a grass crop like corn than it is a non-relative, something like soybean, a legume. And so you kind of do have to match your cover crop with your crop, and allelopathy could be part of that equation, but most of the time you're gonna answer that by choosing other things. So certainly need to think about that.
Okay, we have a question about a roller crimper. Many of the roller crimper images showed the implement rolling in line with the cover crop row. I thought it was better to roll perpendicular or at least at an angle to planting.
Matt, you want to go ahead and take that one?
Sure. It is usually better to roll perpendicular, but that's really only when you have small grains that are in 7.5 inch rows, because when you row in the same direction that you planted your cover crop, when you're using a drill like that, you can get gaps and you can have soil exposure. And when you broadcast seed, though, and that's really what we're moving towards, because not everyone can plant their cover crop perpendicular to the way that they want to plant their cash crop, especially here in Pennsylvania where there's a lot of contour planting related to the hillsides. So what we're looking at is that broadcast seeding, and that really eliminates the need to go in a perpendicular or an offset direction. So that's how we're dealing with it. Some of those photos that you saw there were taken before we really had that figured out, so they may be old figures or old images. But now we do try to do that as much as possible, and that's a good point.
And I would reinforce that broadcast seeding. We know that alone is not as successful as drill seeding, and so the idea again is to use a combination of broadcast and drill. That's what we're looking at, where we're trying to fill in the rows that are left open by the drill with the broadcast. So the combination is important.
Yeah, and you certainly wouldn't need to do that with hairy vetch because
right, and that's for cereal.
Okay, we have two questions about hairy vetch with rye. The first one is, could you interseed to hairy vetch with rye to provide nitrogen and additional ground cover? And someone else asked, on low fertility soils where you want to roll rye for a soybean crop, but you may not get enough rye biomass to suppress weeds, what do you think of mixing a little bit of hairy vetch into the rye to add a bit of biomass?
So those are both really good questions. We have, and farmers have done a lot of work looking at mixtures with rye and hairy vetch, and that is a fairly common mixture. It can become more challenging in organic systems where we're trying to roll, and one of the reasons why is because the rye matures before the hairy vetch. It's susceptible to being able to kill the roller. And so some of the success stories that that we've heard about have been actually rolling multiple times in the spring. So actually you're rolling it the first time to set back the rye, and then you're maybe rolling it again 2 or 3 weeks later to sort of kill the vetch. So that can be a hassle for some people. Actually, one of the things that we've moved to in our research has been a mixture of hairy vetch and triticale, or triticale, as some people call it, which is a cross between wheat and rye. And the nice thing about that is that it matures later than rye does, and it's actually fairly well aligned with when hairy vetch matures, and you can kill it with a roller. It's much more aggressive than wheat. It's taller and produces more biomass, closer to in line with rye, and so that's something that we've done, is moved sort of triticale and hairy vetch rather than rye and hairy vetch. If you weren't trying to kill it with a roller, if you were using it as a green manure, then the rye and hairy vetch would be a nice cover crop combination if you were plowing that down. In front of beans, mixing a little bit of hairy vetch. We've done a little bit of that work, and it kind of depends. This is the way I would answer that. Matt made the comment that we really don't like to plant legumes and then seed legumes into that. I had done some work the last couple of years where I did look at, this is actually triticale and hairy vetch, or in combinations, looking at different ratios, different seeding amounts in front of both corn and soybeans, with the idea that the rye by itself, one of the problems with rye alone is it doesn't completely, unless you get a really nice cover crop, it doesn't really completely cover the ground, and so you can get some weeds coming through, and you put a little bit of hairy vetch with it, and it really does make a nice mulch. One of the problems that we see in soybean in those systems, at least in organic systems, is if that hairy vetch comes back a little bit, it'll set seed, and you'll end up having seed production. It can be a little bit more competitive, I think, with soybeans than it is with corn, and so we sort of have moved away from that. We are using a combination of triticale and hairy vetch in our corn system, and I think you could probably figure out ways to make rye work that way too. But we're not doing that in soybeans right now because we're concerned about, at least in the organic systems where we're relying on rolling, where we're getting some regrowth of the hairy vetch, and some of that vetch is setting seed, and then we're going to have a seed bank, and we're in this particular experiment that we're conducting after soybeans, we plant wheat, and the last thing we want is volunteer hairy vetch in wheat.
The other thing I just want to add to that is that with the hairy vetch in the rye before beans, the other thing you want to think about is uniformity of your rye mulch. With the roller, when the rye rolls down, it usually is quite uniform, but what can happen if you have a little bit of vetch in there is that the rye can be pulled down in different directions, and then you can have bare soil, and that's something that you really want to avoid. So just from a uniformity perspective, it may also not be a good idea. An alternative might be to include another type of small grain in with your rye, such as barley, so that you can have something else in there that grows at slightly differently, but will also contribute to the biomass and will be rolled down and not drag down the rye and make it uneven.
Okay, we have some more questions. We have 2 questions about a cover crop called Camelina sativa. Is there a favorite variety of it that is suggested as a winter cover crop for western Pennsylvania? And if sowing it, do we need to mow down the goldenrod and weeds before seeding it?
So my knowledge of camelina mostly stems from interest in using it as an oilseed crop. It's a mustard. I wouldn't say related to canola, only quite different in appearance. But the interest that I understand in Western PA, particularly up in the northwest part of the state, is looking at it as an oilseed crop for the biofuel production. I don't have any personal experience growing camelina. What I would refer you to is there's a gentleman by the name of Joel Hunter, who's one of our extension educators. He's in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, up in the northwest, and he has a lot of experience with camelina.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 questions about how the planting and termination dates can be adjusted for those further north, and someone else asked, could you share how this might apply to grain operations further north in the United States and Canada?
Matt, you want to try that, or you want me to?
Sure. I think you know, with the planting dates, I think you're just shifting things a little bit forward. I'm not sure how much different it is. If there's any unique differences that would need to be considered, I think it's just you just shift your dates accordingly based on your different hardiness zones. I think most of the cover crops that we've talked about, except for hairy vetch, can be grown up north. Rye certainly is popular in Canada and northern regions. Actually, the rye that we use was developed in Maine, Aroostook County, Maine. So
it's an important point, though, and we've run into that with our own work, where this experiment that Matt referenced with the newsletter, the Rose newsletter. We have the same experiment that's going out in southern Delaware, in northern Maryland, and in central Pennsylvania. And one of the things that's looking at is hairy vetch establishment and termination, and then also rye. And what we have realized, particularly with rye, is in order to get a really nice competitive rye cover crop, you have to establish it relatively early. And so our area, we think, you know, early October would be sort of the latest we'd like to be in there. And so what that means for us when we grow corn, so we're growing corn before we establish the rye, is that we're going to use it in front of silage corn, because it's difficult to grow corn for grain in this region and ensure that it's taken off by the 1st of October. And there's a sort of a similar approach for soybean in planting wheat, and then you could say, well, you could run into the same thing with hairy vetch. Certainly in our area, we need to plant that by maybe the 15th of September at the latest. And so as we go north, unfortunately your options become fewer. And one of the things that we're looking at are selecting our cash crop varieties based on suitability for this. And so we did a variety test with organic corn varieties this summer. We're looking at 80 to 95 day varieties. Which would be quite shorter than some of our more conventional farmers would grow. The idea that we can get those off and we can try to get a cover crop established after the corn comes off. And the same thing could be said for soybeans when we're trying to establish wheat.
And so one of the goals with the shorter season cultivars is that we're trying to increase our rotation flexibility. And some other work going on in Pennsylvania is looking at establishing cover crops in standing cash crops. And Bill has a student that's working on a piece of equipment, cultivation equipment, that would seed cover crops at lay-by cultivation, at the last cultivation, and have that seed ready there so that your cover crops are germinating and establishing while your corn or soybeans are still actively growing. There's another farmer actually in Pennsylvania, Charlie Martin, who developed a high-voice seeder that can actually go through very tall corn later in the season, and what they're doing is establishing cover crops again before the corn comes off to try to again increase that rotation flexibility.
Okay, we just have time for one or two more quick questions. One listener wanted to know whether you fabricated the narrow row seeder or whether it's available from a particular implement company.
So no, we didn't fabricate it. It's actually a commercial seeder that's manufactured by a company called Esch. I'm trying to remember how to spell that. E-S-C-H. I think that's right. They're actually a drill or equipment manufacturing company in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They would love for you to go buy one of their drills.
Okay. What are the nutrient effects of legumes on the surface versus tilled in?
So if you leave a legume on the surface when you kill it, for example with a roller, versus you plow it down, I assume, actually the nutrient effects are very similar between the two. You could make the assumption that you could lose a little bit of nitrogen, but I don't think the evidence has really shown much of that. You could also suggest that perhaps a little bit more nitrogen is available more quickly when you plow it down. But I think from a practical standpoint, from a fertility standpoint anyway, the differences are not that significant. The significance that I think we're discussing today is the weed suppressiveness, that when you incorporate that legume in the soil, you're really eliminating any of that physical suppression, which is the primary suppression that cover crop mulch is contributing. You may still have some chemical or allelopathy, but as I mentioned in my talk, that's something that's not really predictable.
The other thing real quickly is typically when you plow down your cover crops, you want to do that at least 1 to 2 weeks before you would actually go in and plant. And so that 1 to 2 weeks could increase your biomass production compared to plowing it down. If you wait 1 to 2 weeks, you could have more biomass production, more nitrogen production in the legumes, and so you could actually increase the amount of nitrogen that's in the biomass, and that may offset any volatilization or losses that you have with hairy vetch or other legumes.
Okay, this is going to be our last question because we're running out of time. How can you use a live mulch in row cropping or till farming? You never discussed interseeding for those of us who grow vegetables. Can you talk a little about that?
I think that planting cereal rye in the spring can be a very effective living mulch. The thing that you really need to watch out with living mulch is competition for water, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't done so much work with it here in Pennsylvania, is that oftentimes what we see is that when you have an interseeded cover crop, you usually have a very nice cover crop, but your cash crop suffers more than it would if there was a little bit more weeds there. So if you have irrigation, it may work better, or if you're not in a rainfall deficit area, it may work out, but oftentimes it's a water competition issue, and it's not as effective as we might like. Bill might have some other experiences with it.
You know, we're not talking about it today because we don't have much experience with it, quite honestly, and that's because Matt and I both work in you know, mostly grain crop systems. Certainly vegetable systems that have irrigation, there would be a lot more opportunity for those kinds of things, but even dry land, I'm sure if you're from the Northeast, and maybe if you're not, you're familiar with Aragon and Nordell up north of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, that grow vegetables, and they do a lot of interseeding of cover crops. You know, they're sort of the cover crop experts in that area. And theirs is a very complex system, but it's also one that if you're interested in doing that, you should take some time and visit with them. You can find a lot of their information actually on the web if you were to type in Eric Nordell, it's at Beach Creek Farm. There's a number of studies that have been done on their farm, particularly with Cornell University, and there's a lot to learn.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I'd like to thank you all for your questions. And as I mentioned before, if you have additional questions or questions that didn't get answered during the webinar, you can use the Ask an Expert system at extension.org/ask. The address is up on the screen. This webinar will also be posted on the eOrganic website at www.extension.org/organic_production, as well as on, oh wait, no, not going to be on the YouTube channel, not this one, but there are some other ones on the eOrganic YouTube channel. We'd also very much appreciate it if you could fill out our follow-up survey, which you'll be receiving in an email shortly after the webinar. Thank you so much for coming again today, Bill and Matt, and thank you all for joining us.